They were kneeling at the cold marble headstones, hands pressed flat against the stone, as if heat from skin could melt the ache inside. Rain threaded the air like a soft accusation. Marcelo and Amanda had learned in the weeks since the funerals that grief had a shape, a hollow carved around every ordinary thing. A toy left in a corner became a monument. A small pair of sandals at the closet door was a fresh cut you could not stop feeling. They had been told the deaths were natural causes by men in neat suits, and the papers had said what they needed to say. The cemetery had accepted the signatures and the ceremony and the black flowers. The world wanted the matter closed. Then a barefoot girl came up the gravel path. She was thin in a way that made a child's clothes look like a costume, too small, threadbare sleeves, yet her posture was direct, her eyes unafraid. She did not linger with pity. She walked straight to the headstones, placed a small, dirty hand on the carved letters as though counting, then looked up at Marcelo and Amanda and said simply, "They're not here. Miguel and Gabriel live with me at the orphanage." For a moment the rain held its breath. Amanda tightened her fingers on Marcelo's sleeve until skin whitened. Marcelo's first reaction was disbelief so absolute it could have been a defense mechanism. Who here, in this manicured silence, would stake a claim against death? The words were not rational. They did not fit the neat paperwork in his briefcase. But the girl said more. She named the twins' bracelets, thin woven bands painted with bright childish letters. She described Miguel's way of pushing his chin when he lied about having eaten candy. She knew the sound Gabriel made when he tried to whistle and only managed a breathy squeal. She knew the smell of Amanda's perfume that clung to the twins' stuffed bear. Amanda let out the breath she'd been holding since the hospital room. "How do you know that?" she asked, voice brittle with something between anger and hope. The girl looked down at her bare feet, then back up. "I play near the gate. I saw a woman crying outside. The boys had on the bracelets. They came in with her. I'm Marina." That name carried no evidence, only a presence, a small, steady voice that refused to be ignored. Marcelo stared at the dirt under his hands as if it might reveal a map. The marble around them gleamed cold, indifferent, but in the girl's words there was a chink in the fortress of official truth. If the twins were alive, everything they had accepted was a lie. If this story is speaking to you, please subscribe. There are more like this. They did what rich people rarely did. They followed a child into a world they had never meant to enter. Marcelo called an investigator he knew, a discreet man who had once done favors and now took cases with an accountant's patience. Amanda hired a driver who could navigate through neighborhoods that had become unfamiliar to them overnight. They left their cars in an avenue that smelled of car exhaust and fried bread, the leather seats rolling away from them like a memory. Their mansion, with its quiet rooms and untouched beds, stayed behind like an accusation. The orphanage rose behind a cracked gate, a squat building that had once promised refuge and now smelled of damp and old paint. The sign above the door had letters flaking like old skin. Children's voices leaked out in the cadence of anything alive. Marina led them through a back alley, avoiding the main door, passing a broken swing. The air inside was a different world, closer, louder, smaller. The walls were painted in colors that had lost their brightness. The bathroom tiles held a history of small hands. Hidden corners harbored folded blankets and whispered secrets.
a mattress shoved under a window, a pencil stub, a box stuffed with mismatched toys. They found the twins in a room the size of a pantry. Two small bodies were curled on a thin mattress, dirt smudged across knees, hair matted from endless play. Miguel opened his eyes and for a wild instant did not register anything except a small, insistent voice that felt like home. Then his face cleared, as if remembering a song. "Mama?" he breathed, as if the word had been a key. Amanda moved without control. Mothers do not negotiate with gravity. She simply closed the distance between sorrow and the two small chests rising under her palms. The embrace was immediate and total. Amanda's cry filled the room with a sound that had no pretense of composure. Marcelo stood for a fraction of a beat, watching his wife hold the boys, and then let the dam inside him break. He dropped down, hands fumbling for the small wrists. There were bracelets, as Marina had said, threaded bands, one scarred from a fall, the other with the letters M and G smeared by time. Gabrielle's thumb found Marcelo's jawline in the same absent way he used to search for comfort. Recognition happens on the axis of voice and touch more than on paper. The boys knew those sounds. The first reunion was not cinematic in any tidy way. It was messy, uncontrolled, the edges of tears mingling with laughter that tasted like recrimination and relief. Amanda whispered names as if they were petitions, as if speaking them could undo weeks of absence. Marcelo felt his anger rise, the simplest form of a man's rage when someone steals what is his to protect. He thought of the neat signatures and the polite phrases that declared his sons dead. He thought of the funeral flowers and the black ribbons. In that tiny room, under a thin mattress, all of that bureaucracy unraveled into the small, fierce certainty of two breathing boys. But the paper trail that said otherwise did not evaporate with their embrace. It waited like a bruise. Back at the mansion, when their clothes were burned clean of dust and their hands still smelled faintly of the orphanage, Amanda pushed a stack of documents across the dining table.
The death certificates were stamped. The signatures in a practiced loop belonged to a name they would come to know, Dr. Claudio Mendez. The name was printed in bold on a letterhead. Marcelo's investigator tapped the page with a finger and said something that made Amanda's stomach drop. Dr. Claudio Mendez did not exist in their city's medical registry. The clinic listed on the certificate was a mailbox. A soft, anonymous envelope arrived at the house soon after, the message inside typed without warmth. "You should have left it alone." The message was simple in language and heavy in intent. Who would send such a thing, and why? Marcelo spent nights replaying the years he had shared with Renata, his ex-wife. He had tried to keep his distance from that chapter of his life, but the investigator's attention turned in that direction quietly. Transactions that did not align, a broker's whisper, a set of payments to accounts with names that folded and changed like paper boats. The cruelest thing about betrayal is that it often hides in plain sight, pretending to be a necessary transaction. When evidence began to point toward Renata, Marcelo felt a peculiar twist of emotion. Grief reopened into anger, but the scales shifted. Now it was personal and public at once. Renata had never accepted the divorce. Her pride lived in the exact same silence that had allowed the twins to disappear. She was a woman of means who cultivated an image of control. If a man's life could be rearranged with enough legal papers and confident signatures, she had the means to make it happen. Before they could move the boys to a place of safety, before they could change locks and rearrange the world so it no longer fit what had happened, Marina and the children vanished.
The orphanage had been compromised, a back window forced, a door left open when the wind should not have made it so. The mattress was gone, the bracelets were gone. Only a scrap of fabric and a small brooch remained where the boys had slept, a tiny ornament with the letter R engraved on its clasp. A luggage tag with a faded hotel chain's logo was found near a bus depot, the barcode scrubbed, the handwriting on it hurried, check-in, noon. Marcelo felt a cold ferocity that had a physical presence. He assembled a team, the investigator, a private security detail, and one detective who was not prone to poetic pronouncements, someone who simply believed that evidence could be followed to a person. They worked in the spaces between the official police reports, which were careful and slow, and Marcelo's burning need to pull the boys back into his arms. The trail led through a city that seemed to change its face as they moved through it. The smells shifted from lemon oil and roasted coffee to frying oil and damp cloth. Someone had driven a car with an unfamiliar engine into a district where the streetlights were often out.
They followed leads, an alley where a van had been parked, a discarded fast food wrapper with a receipt showing a time that matched the orphanage's earliest morning rays. Small clues accreted into a pattern, a hooded man seen near an old warehouse, a woman's voice on a phone talking about moving them before someone noticed. They found the children in a long corridor of a storage complex at the city's edge, a place where light leaked in through high windows and dust hung in slashes. The twins were tied but alive, the ropes coarse against their wrists. Marina sat beside them, her hands bloody where she had tried to free one knot after another. At the sight of Marcelo and Amanda, the boys' faces folded into recognition again, then into a furious desire to run into the safety of their parents. Amanda dropped to her knees and untied them as Marcelo called the police. The hooded man bolted then, a smear in the doorway, and one of the security men sprinted after him into sunlight. The pursuit was a blur, the man's cap tossed aside, a narrow alleyway, the sound of someone cursing, and then a bench. The hooded figure twisted, reached for something under a jacket. A second man stepped out from the shadows, a silent accomplice. Marcelo watched with a clarity that sometimes only comes when someone else's life is at stake. He understood with shocking aperture that the perpetrator's motives were not only about custody, but about a grip on a narrative. Whoever controlled the story controlled the children. Renata, when she finally stepped out of the shadow of her denials and into the light of confrontation, did not look surprised to see him. She had the composure of someone who had rehearsed every argument. When the police arrived and lights strobed off the parked cars, she stood with her chin raised, a single finger steadying a silk scarf. "You didn't have to do this," Marcelo said, not as a plea, but as a ledger of harm. Renata's laugh was a thin thing. "You left me," she said. "I did what I had to do to survive. You had everything." The detective who had coordinated the rescue put handcuffs on the accomplice first, then, with procedural calm, moved towards Renata. She looked at the twins as if they were objects to be appraised, not children who had been pulled through darkness and back. "You went too far to her," the detective told her. "Lives were in danger." Renata's answer was not of regret. "I wanted her to feel what I felt. Power was taken from me." It was a confession that had the weight of nothing but self-justification. The legal machinery moved from there with a dignity that did not feel celebratory. Statements were taken, evidence catalogued, but the narrative had shifted back into the safe hands of facts. The brooch, the luggage tag, phone records, the anonymous payments traced back to accounts controlled by someone who had much to lose.
In the days after Renata's arrest, the world around Marcelo and Amanda became procedural in ways they had never expected. Courts took a long breath. Lawyers spoke in temperate tones. There were hearings and petitions, and the city seemed suddenly interested in the fate of two boys who were, to most people, small and unverifiable actors in someone else's drama. Somewhere in the background, a judge ruled that Renata had been involved in falsifying documents, death certificates, a fake doctor's signature, a chain of assertions that had been woven to break a family and then claim a different kind of ownership. She was held to account. The city's papers reported the arrest, the editorialists wrote about the corruption of privilege, and the twins, finally, were free to grow up under their parents' names again. But legal closure did not make the nights stop. The children still woke in the dark, fingers searching for the familiar shape of a parent. Amanda could not sleep without a low sound in her throat that was the memory of the orphanage's thin mattress. Marcelo had to learn to listen for small noises, the way kids make a sound that is not quite a call and not quite a demand. They started therapy not out of showy necessity, but because grief had taught them the language of small fractures. They needed to heal the ways absence had left its mark. Marina, who had saved them by walking up to a marble grave and speaking the simplest truth she knew, did not ask for thanks in the way adults might understand it. She had come into their lives barefoot and proud, with dirt still under her nails and a stubbornness that refused to be softened. Marcelo found himself watching her at the edges of their household, waiting for the moment she recognized that she had been enrolled into a life completely different from the one she had always known. Amanda bought her a small dress that hung like a promise. Marcelo, who had spent his life keeping things tidy and guarded, taught her how buttons worked and how to tie a shoelace. Marina learned to sleep on a mattress that did not fold at the edges. For the first few nights, she left a little corner of her new room untidy, as if keeping a map back to where she had come from. There is a delicate choreography to adopting someone into your life who has already saved you. Gratitude and humility must be balanced with boundaries. Marcelo and Amanda were careful not to erase Marina's past or to turn her into a symbol. They invited her into their family as an equal, not as a rescue that made them better people. On Sundays, they sat together in the kitchen and taught each other small things, Amanda showing Marina how to fold napkins into neat triangles, Marina showing Amanda how to catch a beetle and release it outside instead of killing it. The boys learned to share toys. They learned, painfully and with fits, to trust that the routine of being fed and tucked in and kissed goodnight would not be interrupted by a signed piece of paper.
Marina's role in the story was never called Angel in the house, at least not by Marcelo. But to the twins, she had a certain wonder. She had brought them back from a place no grown-up had imagined. Amanda, later, slipped into conversation the phrase that would become a family joke. "Our angel has no wings, just good souls." They laughed then, and it felt like repair. There were quieter scenes that healed in ways paperwork could not. The family spent an entire afternoon introducing Marina to small indulgences, a cone of sorbet that melted in the sun and left sticky hands, a borrowed bike whose squeaky bell made them all laugh, an evening where Marcelo attempted to teach the twins to skip, tripping himself and landing in a heap of good-natured embarrassment. There was a day when Marina, wearing a bright blue dress that Amanda had bought, climbed a small ladder and read aloud from a picture book. Her voice wavered at the sentences that spoke of home, but it grew steadier as the boys edged closer and put their heads on her shoulders. The public parts of the story receded. Renata's trial became a chapter in a local news cycle, then a final paragraph.
She was convicted on charges that included producing false documents and the abduction scheme that had forced the family into a week of searching and fear. The legal result did not feel like revenge. It felt like a necessary acknowledgement. Someone had used power to manipulate truth, and there was a cost. Renata's face in court, stiff, betrayed by the hard lines of someone who had counted on etiquette to shield her, was the mirror Marcelo had not wanted to see. The sentence was a sentence. It did not heal the weeks lost, but it did, in the small administrative way that law can, carve a boundary. It said that the city recognized what had been stolen and attempted to restore the order. Time in the household became the slow instrument of recovery. The twins trailed into school with backpacks that smelled of new fabric, and Marcelo learned to stand in the doorway and let Amanda handle lunches. There were therapy appointments where a small, efficient woman with a gentle voice taught the boys to name their fears. There were afternoons of quiet rebuilding, fixing bike chains, repainting a room a color chosen by committee, the ritual of checking under beds and in closets as if making sure that absence would not sneak back in. Marina's integration into the family did not erase the world she had come from. They allowed her to carry both places inside her. Once a month she walked with Amanda to the orphanage to bring supplies, books, a blanket, a bar of soap. She sat in the same corridors she had once prowled and smiled differently now, carrying the proof that small hands can change narratives. The orphanage, to the outside world, remained flawed. Funding was scarce, and sometimes officials failed to act quickly.
But the fact that the twins had been there and had been seen by a child who refused to be invisible stayed on the record like an asterisk to a story about what it means to notice. There were moments of ordinary joy that stitched up the household in surprising ways. One afternoon, the family put a small table out in the yard and made ice cream with a cheap, hand-cranked churner. The sound, a clack and a churn, sugar dissolving into cream, filled the yard. The boys stuck faces full of sweetness into cones until their lips were stained pink. Marina, at first hesitant with the unfamiliar texture, laughed when a drip slid down her elbow. She kept her shoes off, feet in the grass, and at sunset they lay together and watched clouds. Marcelo reflected, not in grand pronouncements, but in small, private gratitude, on how a barefoot girl had introduced herself to him on a wet day, and then refused to be ignored. Sometimes, at night, when the house was quiet and small lights burned in bedrooms like tiny beacons, Marcelo would stand by the upstairs window and let the city lights make constellations. He had been a man used to solving problems with contracts and signatures. He had learned the hard way that some losses cannot be solved by money. He could pay for security cameras and lawyers, but he could not purchase intact childhoods. What he could do, and what he did, was show up. He could hold. He could be present in ways that mattered, day after day. Months later, a neighbor asked how they had found the boys. The neighbor expected a dramatic confession, a blow-by-blow tale of suspense. Marcelo answered simply, and it was his truth. A girl spoke the truth when no one else would. We listened. Amanda smiled and added, "She taught us that the invisible can still be loud if you have the courage to hear it." Marina, who had by then acquired a lingering fondness for cotton candy at the summer fair and a careful way of tucking in her shirt, stood beside them and did not say "angel," but put her small hand in Marcelo's and squeezed. It was a contract without signatures. In time, the family learned to tell the story in quiet fragments. They did not dramatize the moments of fear for entertainment.
They held the memory as tender and fierce, a blueprint of what had been lost and recovered. Renata's part in the narrative became a warning that cruelty can wear a polished smile and that power can be used to rewrite facts. But the core of the story, the part they repeated when the boys asked why they had to be so careful sometimes, was about the barefoot girl who refused to be invisible. There was a simple public acknowledgement one afternoon when Marcelo and Amanda stood in the orphanage yard and handed a certificate, an unofficial ribbon of appreciation, into Marina's small fists. It was clumsy and awkward because gratitude rarely fits neatly into paper, but Marina accepted it with a dignity the adults found humbling. For the first time, she wore shoes that fit.
She had a school bag. She had a name that did not have to be shouted to be believed. The final scenes of their shared days were not cinematic explosions, but daily life breathing. The twins learned to ride bikes without training wheels, a small revolution in itself. Marina began school, where she told one teacher, in a voice older than her years, that her favorite subject was making things stay. She meant paper, glue, and the people she had rescued. When the family gathered in the yard one afternoon, sun warming their faces and the boys chasing a stray ball, Marcelo thought of the marble headstones and the rain that had seemed like judgment. He thought of the night he had been a man knelt in despair, and then of the small, unglamorous child who had walked up and spoken the truth. That moment had shifted everything. It had forced him to see how many things in the world are wrapped in protocol, and how many things are hidden in plain sight. He had been taught, in the bluntest possible way, to look where others did not. He later told Amanda, in a sentence he wanted to be remembered, "We almost buried truth today. We would have carried that weight forever if not for her feet on the gravel." Amanda squeezed his hand and looked at Marina, now kicking her shoes off into the grass. "She kept our story from ending," she said. "We keep hers now." There was, finally, a quiet lesson that stayed with them all. Family is not only what you have by blood or by law. Sometimes it is what you choose to protect, to feed, to teach, and to forgive. Marina did not become a symbol for the family to hang on their wall. She became a living, breathing member with small opinions about breakfast cereal and a laugh that made Marcelo drop his newspaper. The boys taught her how to build a spaceship from boxes. Amanda taught her how to fold napkins into triangles. Marcelo taught her how to tell time by watching the shadow of the backyard pergola. On one ordinary evening, as twilight settled and the city's noise became a distant hum, Marcelo sat on the back step and watched the three children, two born from his love and one who had somehow rerouted his heart, run under a sky that finally felt theirs. He did not promise them a world without pain. He could not. But he did promise that their names would be spoken at dinner tables and at school, that anyone who tried to silence them would have to face more than signatures and quiet offices. They would face a household that refused to let their story be stolen again. In the end, the line that opened this strange chapter, spoken by a barefoot girl at the marble graves, became a family memory, a truth told in the soft currency of everyday life. The girls and boys who had once been invisible were now unmistakably seen. If this story touched you, share it with someone who cares, and remember the children who are waiting for someone to hear them.